Hi, I'm Peter Breggin, Peter R. Breggin, MD. I'm a psychiatrist. This is the fourth in my series of simple truths about psychiatry. And the topic today is going to be the patient who is psychotic and gets labeled schizophrenic, and what would really most effectively help that individual. The first three presentations in this series have been about the limits of psychiatric drugs and how they are harmful to the brain. And I think it's time to take a little break from that and look at how do we help, without using drugs, some of the most very upset people. And then my next presentation, following this one, will be on helping the person who's so depressed that he or she is suicidal. So we'll just really confront these issues directly. I got started in psychiatry when I was 18 years old. I was a freshman at Harvard College, planning to go on and probably major, well, I was majoring in American history and literature and thinking maybe I'd be a professor in the future years. And a friend of mine invited me to volunteer at Metropolitan State Hospital. It was 1954. We went out to the hospital, which sat, as so many of them do, like a medieval fortress on the top of a hill outside of a town. And when we entered the hospital, my immediate impression from the stench, from the dilapidated conditions, from the bent over and humiliated patients, was my Uncle Dutch's descriptions of liberating an extermination camp toward the end of World War II. It profoundly affected me. Now, I don't know why, but spontaneously, I felt that if I had been in those conditions, living like that, confined like that, abused and deprived and lonely, that I wouldn't be able to keep my sanity. And as I would visit with the patients, and I can't exactly tell you why, I never had a sense that, oh, you're different from me, you're defective, I'm not. I always had a sense of, there but for the grace of God go I. That this could happen to anyone, that life could break anyone emotionally, was my sense of it. And certainly I thought at that time, at the age of 18, that I was not invulnerable. Well, I ended up leading this program, even wrote a book about it, my first book, and lecturing about the program. So I got really involved as just a young boy, really, in this whole field of mental health. And I went to the superintendent and I said that, we've got like a dozen of us and we want to do more than just visit with the patients and take them on trips and clean the wards and have parties and stuff. We think that it would be really helpful if each of us had our own patient that we visited every week during the school year. And we have this lovely social worker who's willing to supervise us, and that won't take but an hour or two of his time a week to supervise us. The principal. It's an interesting slip because it's a bit like being in school, I guess, only the worst parts of school. The superintendent of the hospital got mad at me about this. But eventually he realized that if we left his hospital and went to another hospital, that we were actually the best thing that had happened in a long time. We were already getting good publicity for the hospital. So he gave a group of us, about 12 as I recall, each our own patient that we could work with. And they gave us patients who were so bad off that they thought we couldn't hurt them, patients they expected to spend the rest of their lives in the hospital. And I describe this scene of the hospital and the outcome in the opening chapter of Toxic Psychiatry. We got all but 3 of the patients out of the hospital. And over a follow-up period, only 2 or 3 came back. So I learned right away that the psychiatric treatments were doing more harm than good. And in the case of the State Mental Hospital, horribly more harm than good. And that the answer to helping even the most disturbed human being under the worst possible conditions was human relationship. And again, I can't tell you exactly why, But from the start, it looked to me like it was about love. It was about people caring for each other. So back in the 50s, I was already writing about love as healing. Hadn't yet read Buber's I and Thou and other sophisticated books about this idea. And that's why I went into psychiatry. But psychiatry was changing because at the same time the drugs came in. Thorazine, the first of the really heavy lobotomizing drugs. And psychiatry moved so strongly in the drug direction that there was no room. By the time I graduated medical school and started in psychiatry, there's no room anymore for a psychological or a social psychiatry because we were on the way to the psychiatry of today, which is I'll diagnose you and drug you and send you home, and maybe a social worker will talk to you along the way, maybe. Excuse me. So by the time I finished and went into private practice, I knew that psychiatry had gone in one direction and I was going in a psychological and social direction for helping people. Now, let's look at the most serious kind of a problem. The person who becomes really, really crazy. Let's say it's a 16-year-old girl. And abruptly, after a period of shyness usually, and a feeling somewhat withdrawn, and being a little maybe different than other kids, this young woman begins to hallucinate. She begins to hear voices blaming her for things, voices persecuting her, voices talking mean to her. She begins to think that she's somebody who's very special and is somehow the center of a great deal of activity by other people, that people are maybe conspiring against her. Her mother and father are working with the CIA or with some other organization. If she gets disturbed enough, at some point she might think that maybe she saw for a minute that her father had a tail or that her mother had horns. And she's frightened out of her mind. Well, what's going on here? It's not as complicated as it may seem. What's going on is that the social connections, the social fabric of this person's life has begun to tear apart. When people are functioning normally, we're very creative. We can do all kinds of varieties of things and people look really different. But when people are breaking down, you get a lower common denominator and things begin to look more similar from person to person. And so the person who is psychotic has hallucinations or delusions, and their thoughts can be very strange and not make any sense. And they're also helpless. And they're usually, in the case of somebody who's going to end up with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, I don't use those diagnoses, but they're there. That person's been shy and withdrawn, and you see a process taking place. The process is one of no longer trusting people. So where do you go when you're so frightened and usually so ashamed of yourself? Usually a lot of shame involved. And what do you do when you're so ashamed of yourself and you're so frightened that you don't believe anybody could care for you, you don't believe anybody could trust you, you don't trust anybody? Where do you go? Well, if you're the sort of creative, imaginative person who's going to get labeled schizophrenic, you go into what looks like very bad metaphors, broken poetry, and nightmarish, literally nightmarish kinds of experiences. And rarely are they comforting. The breakdown is not comforting. So what is the beginning of recovery for this person? It's not very complicated. It's the building of a trusting relationship with someone. And hopefully, if the parents are responsible and are willing to participate, healing the broken social threads of the family. That's the answer. That's the answer. Without even worrying about why one person becomes very disturbed and another doesn't, and how much is the mother to blame or the parents to blame, and Why does the social fabric unravel? Without even worrying about that, we do know what heals, and the family heals. And a caring therapy relationship can heal. Surprisingly, one of the most astonishingly effective moments in therapy is the first session with a young person who's not heavily drugged, hopefully not drugged at all, who's just brought in and who's very, very crazy. And you sit with that person quietly and reassure them. I start out by saying, it's safe for you to tell me anything you want because I never lock up people against their will. And I know that I heard that there was a threat that you might get locked up, and say, I don't do that. And I don't give drugs when people have a lot of emotional upset. I mean, you could tell me the most frightening thing possible. I'm not going to give you psychiatric drugs. So it's just safe. We can just talk. And I can see some of the fear melt when the person begins to think that maybe I actually care about their feelings and I want to have a safe space with them. I want to create a caring place where I give off an aura of healing, an aura of caring, an aura of empathy, because I'm actually feeling it. It doesn't fake very well, believe me. Under those conditions, you will see a person come back from deep craziness within a relatively short time. You can even see it in minutes. You can see that by halfway through an hour and a half, the person's no longer cocking their head and listening, or looking out the window, or staring at their feet. The person's relating to you. And if you stop for a minute and you say, are you still hearing things? They might say, no. No, it's not all over. It's not going to be like life is all fun and games after that. But you can see this process happen quickly. Now, if you've got mom and dad there, and maybe grandma, maybe somebody else out, from the family, a friend, out in the waiting room, and then you bring in everybody, and you talk to them about how you want to help heal their relationships. It's not going to be a blaming of who did what to whom. It's not going to do that. We're going to talk about how do we relate to each other in a loving way, and I'll use the word loving. I know most people can go to psychiatrists for 10 years and never hear the word, but I think it's the key word. How are we going to communicate in a supportive, caring, and loving manner? And maybe as a start, just respectfully. So, let's don't do that disrespectful stuff. I know you're all upset, but let's try another approach. And if the family, the parents are willing to respond to that, you can help a person in a matter of weeks, not even months or years. You can help somebody who had a breakdown in the summer go back to school in the fall. Now, this is not some new news. This is not a great therapist in action kind of business. In fact, if you're going to be a good therapist, you have to give up being a great therapist, and you have to think of your clients and patients as having greatness. They're supposed to be the ones that walk out feeling great, not you. But this has been done again and again over centuries. Back in the 1800s and the late 1700s, there was an era called moral therapy, where facilities usually run by Quakers, the Tuke family in England, treated people of the most disturbed kind with kindness and caring and detailed instructions on how the aides had to be educated and being respectful and thoughtful and not overreacting. And as one of the Tukes wrote, and keeping the medical people out with their toxic treatments. And as best we can tell, the rates of people recovering were at least as good as now, and people aren't getting all these horrible drug reactions and terrible neurological disorders and shortened lifespan and dementia that the drugs we use to treat these folks can produce. And then in this country, Lauren Mosier created something called Soteria House, and you can just Google moral therapy. You can Google Soteria House. You can read my brain disabling treatments in psychiatry. Has a section about this in it. And toxic psychiatry has a section in it. But you can Google a lot of this. Google Soteria House or Lauren Mosier. He showed that if you took a group of people and had them go to a residential home run by a social worker not a psychiatrist, and where all the aides were chosen not for their credentials, but for their ability to care and be gentle and non-coercive. And you sent some folks there, and then as a controlled clinical trial, you sent some folks randomly to the local mental hospital, people who did better without the drugs in Soteria House. Now, psychiatry responded by pushing Lauren Mosier, who was the head of the schizophrenia branch at NIMH when he did these studies. They pushed him out. And then California eventually, after many years, closed down Soteria House, but not until books and innumerable articles have been written about it. So I wanted you to know at the start, because I've been real critical of the drugs in the first few of my presentations, that there are very, very good solutions to helping disturb people. But they run counter to the drug companies, to the government programs, to the organized medicine. We need the public to be demanding these things. And there's another good program you can Google. It's called Open Dialogues. Just Google Open Dialogues. It's a Finnish program. And in that program, when people start to have a breakdown in the community, in Lapland specifically, Lapland, Finland, a team goes to the home and has an open dialogue. They talk among themselves, they talk with the family, they talk with the patient, and they have a saying that schizophrenia exists in between the members of the family. And they're so effective that they rarely use psychiatric drugs. They even more rarely use the heavy antipsychotic drugs. They've been so effective that the rate of so-called schizophrenia is down to almost zero because people are being helped in Lapland by these caring, family-oriented interventions. We're not ignorant about how to help people. We are not ignorant about how to help the most disturbed people. I was doing it when I was 18. Therapists around the world are still doing it. We have projects around the world. But we need you, the public, to say, this is what we want. We want caring havens to go to when we're in desperation. Thanks.